Good morning. Congratulations. We are on the first day of spring 2025. I'm Scott Forcino, Associate Broker at Real Brokerage. I have Scott Einbinder, a real estate trainer, sales, and mortgage lending specialist. We are excited that based on the first segment that we created, that is training for buyer's agents, and a second for lenders, how to serve the real estate industry, their referral partners, and their clients themselves. We're now on to the listing agent, which I think, and Scott really firmly believes, is the coup de grace of the industry. It always was list to last, but now based on the new policy changes and the challenges to buyer's agents who cannot or choose not to pay for their own representation, Scott believes that people who are buying will go to the listing agents, how to capitalize on that. So we're in this, maybe as Scott says, the golden age of real estate. And Scott, the floor is yours. And what do you think is the best way to be a listing agent today?
Well, I think that, a couple of things that you said. First off, this whole policy thing, it isn't about forcing buyers and sellers to do anything. It's about choice and transparency, right? If we really see this for what it is, that's really has been the change, right? This much more awareness that needs to be put into the lap of buyers and sellers. The industry has, been saying for a few years, sellers have always had choice. Sellers has always, yeah, it's true. They've always had choice. But did they really understand their choice? It's like going, someone made a good analogy to me. It's like when you go into the hospital and you sign all those papers, you got lots of choices. But do you know your choices? Do you really go through them? I mean,
when you say choices, you're saying choice of what to pay in commission.
Right. Choice of what to pay in commission. So at the end of the day, this whole thing behind this whole change of policy, we know the impact both on the buyer agent side and on the listing agent side. But, you said something, list to last. You didn't always have to be a listing agent to last. There were many buyer's agents who ran their whole career. In fact, most buyer's agents ran the majority of their career earning commission incomes as a buyer's agent. Now, again, the commission conversation never was part of that conversation. So we know that in the world of choice and transparency, if you're doing it correctly with the buyer, in the buyer agreement, you're giving that buyer choice, right? You're giving them choice of services, choice of exclusivity or non-exclusivity. You're giving them choice of territory. So there's a lot of choices there, and choice, and now the ability for a buyer to negotiate a commission with you, right? I mean, that's on the buyer side. On the listing side, which is where it really all kind of, stemmed from, historically, now we have this environment where sellers, if it's being done correctly, in my view, sellers now have much more understanding of how commissions, we can't use the word share anymore, but how commissions are allocated. And, from a listing agent's perspective, this is a home run, because if you were a listing agent and you're a good listing agent, you did a very good job in your career of articulating your value as a listing agent and whatever that commission associated with it was, whether it was 1, 2, 3, whatever percent you tacked on as your listing side. You did a good job at that. But what you also did as a good listing agent is you negotiated and you articulated a compensation for a buyer's agent who the listing agent didn't know who that buyer's agent was going to be. The seller didn't know who that buyer's agent was going to be. The listing agent didn't know what the offer was going to be, what the years of experience was going to be of the agent. But yet that listing agent negotiated the compensation of somebody else. In fact, the somebody else was the person who was giving their services to somebody else. But yet the listing agent did a wonderful job of negotiating the compensation for that unknown person.
Crazy.
Now we have a world where the listing agent has a tremendous opportunity where, let's go back to that listing side. right? Because I believe that there were and are and is, there are many listing agents where they were restricted to some extent, and maybe even in their own mind, to increase their listing side to the seller. There was only so far they could go because they knew they then had to have another conversation about buyer compensation. So if I thought, let's say I was a 2.5% or a 3% listing side agent, right? And I felt I could, I'm worth 4 or 4.5. In some cases, I might have been mentally restricted to go there because I knew I had to now deal with the seller on that other piece of compensation, right? That was part of it. Now, as a listing agent, you really have a lot of freedom. You can now, if you think your value proposition is higher than what it was in the past, or maybe you felt you were doing more, but you couldn't really charge it because you still had to acquire that buyer compensation from the seller, you're now free to not have to do that, right? You can now be kind of a free agent, unrestricted, and sell your value proposition for what your value proposition is directly to that seller.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me is a tremendous thing. Now, as far as, you have to list to last. Remember, if you were a buyer's agent, you maybe you've gone your whole career as a buyer's agent, but now we know that a buyer agent is going to have to develop a new skill. I mean, a buyer agent is going to have to develop a new skill. And again, we'll get into, what's happening now with respect to compensation and the fact that sellers are still offering. But as a listing agent, you really are now unshackled to articulate your value proposition to whatever you think your value proposition is. And the big thing that's looming over the industry, the big black cloud hanging over everything is, well, how do we communicate with sellers regarding buyer compensation? And this is where you have what I call the great divide. You've got listing agents and companies, right, who are very, very locked in on trying to convince sellers to offer compensation. Now, this whole thing, trying to convince, I mean, there's nothing wrong with trying to convince. I mean, this becomes a very emotional issue because, you have to try. It's not about trying to convince. It's laying it up there for a seller to understand the perceived pros and cons of the path to take it. So when it comes to buyer compensation as a listing agent, you're seeing two or three different ways of doing it, right? You've got the listing agents, whether it's them or their company, who have been given the edict that you must do everything within your power to get a seller to offer compensation to a buyer's agent, and do everything within your power to get them to commit to a number, right? Whether the number in your market is, 1, 2, 3, or 4%, it doesn't matter. But you've got this perspective that you should, it's in the seller's best interests to offer out compensation specifically with a stated amount to buyer's agents. And you've got this one perspective. Then you've got another perspective out there where listing agents, this is to me back to choice and transparency. Nobody should be telling sellers what they should or shouldn't do, right? But what you should do is give the seller the choice and the options and the pluses and the minuses. So let's talk about the other option, the other way in which listing agents are approaching sellers by saying, listen, I am not saying that you should or should not offer compensation, but if you want to offer compensation and we think that might be a good thing, if you think it's a good thing, we can tell every buyer agent who wants to know if there's compensation, we can say, yes, we are willing to offer compensation. We're willing to offer compensation. And under the new rules, under the new policy, as a seller, I mean, I as the listing agent can't offer you compensation, but as a seller, yeah, if a seller, if you want to offer compensation to a buyer's agent, you can do so. But you don't have to commit to a number in advance. You don't have to commit. The way it used to be is you would commit to a number, it would go in the MLS, and that was the number. There was no renegotiation of that number. There was no pulling back of that number, meaning that once that transaction went under contract, it was locked in stone. There was no other alternative once it was put in the MLS. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if you want to, you can give me the permission to let buyer's agents know that you are willing to offer compensation, but we're not willing to commit to what that compensation is until A, we know how much compensation the buyer agent is looking for. I mean, how could we commit to it? We don't know. So what we could do, Mr. Seller, is say, or Mrs. Seller, we can say, yes, we're willing to offer compensation. So buyer agent, submit your compensation, submit your offer. I mean, how can my seller determine what compensation to offer you if they don't know what you want and they have no idea what that net dollar is going to look like?
Right.
It's like selling your car in your driveway for $10,000 and you offer out a fee of a certain amount of money, and regardless of what that offer looks like, right? You don't do it. You're gonna decide once you see what everyone's looking for. So when sellers are given this option of knowing that they could still offer compensation, they're willing to play in the arena with buyer's agents, but they want to wait. Now, that is frustrating to buyer's agents, especially given the way our business ran for decades. When I'm a buyer agent and I knew that I never had to have a conversation with a buyer about it, I never had to discuss it, I could put my client in contract and not even do an amazing job. It was locked in stone. It was the way it was. So that is frustrating to buyer agents. Buyer agents don't like it in some cases that they have to unpack their commission with their client, with their buyer, before they even do their job, which that's a whole separate conversation. I mean, one would argue that if you're being hired by a buyer before they go out and see a house, shouldn't that buyer know what you're asking for compensation-wise? Shouldn't they know the services? Shouldn't they know all those things before you go out and they go to work for you? Buyer agents never had to do that. So
True.
It's frustrating. That's what you're seeing is frustration with buyer agents. They don't like it. Understandably so. Understandably so. Don't like it. So that's what you're dealing with, is the frustration of the new way, right? So if you're a listing agent, you really have three options that you can lay in front of your seller. Option one, Mr. Seller, you don't have to offer any compensation. Number two, if you want to do it the way it's been done for 50 years, come up with an amount of compensation, give me permission to tell the whole world, and regardless of the agent, regardless of their experience, regardless of the offer, regardless of the price and terms, we'll put it out there into the world. Or the third option, we're willing to offer compensation, we're willing to play with others, but we're going to sit back and wait and see to find out how much are they asking for and what are the terms and conditions. So, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you have three choices in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Now, so along those lines, we're going to talk about something you feel strongly about, dual agency, in a minute. But along those lines, historically, listing agents would decide whether it's a cash buyer is better than a buyer that needs financing, whether a buyer that needs financing is better than a buyer that needs to sell a house to secure financing. There's those things. Now, do you think there's a push for not just greed, because I'm not saying that listing agent would make even $1 more than their listing commission. Do you think that there will be an interest in a seller for a listing agent to say, let's attract our own buyer. We don't need the buyer to come with some zealous advocate and we'll treat them fairly and within due agency, and we'll have the best possible deal.
Well, that now we're kind of leaning into another area there. But what I would say before we get into that, I want to talk about, this whole thing about, when a seller looks at a realtor, at their listing agent, and says, and this is the big question: should I or shouldn't I offer compensation? And why should I or why shouldn't I? Right? Isn't that the question?
Yes, sir.
That is the underlying message that many in the industry are putting in front of the seller. And this is where you get emotional again. This is where everybody gets crazy, right? This is where you get those who are, let's say, non-adopters, or the fighters and the don't want you, because this is the message, and this is the problem that I've always had with it. When we send a message to a seller, listen. And however we send this message, whether it's subtle or it's overt, and you say, listen, if you don't offer compensation, something bad is going to happen. This is the problem, is that some in the industry are trying to send a message to a seller that if they don't offer compensation, something bad is going to happen. And what is the bad thing? You're not going to get offers. You're not going to get enough offers. Agents won't bring their buyer, right? You're not going to get the most money for your house if you don't offer.
It will limit showings.
This is the message that is sent. Now, that message of something bad is going to happen, we have to understand that there's two parts to that message. The first part might even be an agent's belief system that it's going to happen. But the other piece of it is how the industry runs. You see, if I'm a brokerage and I have realtors, and I know that in order for me to have a company, my buyer agents need money to live. And if I adopt any strategy that could limit their money, I could be limiting my company, right? So this is not a pure statement of it's going to be good for you, Mr. Seller. It's also self-serving to the industry, which it is. Like, let's just call it what it is, right? There's an industry benefit of this, which we understand. So let's go back to the first one: more money for your house. Now, there have been endless studies on buyer compensation. Now, and does buyer compensation bring you more money for your home? Now, the first thing is the industry ran for decades where 100% of the listings was offering compensation. So how would you know? How would you ever know? There was no data to really support that. Now, you can't use FSBO data. That's not relevant. We're talking about the broker business, right? There was no alternative source, but there is another thing behind it. And this is, again, it gets emotional, and sometimes agents get out of their skull when you say this. So let's say we have a listing. Forget the listing side. You have a listing where there's 3% offered to a buyer's agent. And then there's another listing that's offering 2.5% buyer's agent commission. Now, is there any proof that the commission that's offering 3 is going to get more money than the listing that's offering 2.5?
No.
Is there any data? Let's go. How about we offer 2% versus 3? Is there any data that says, well, the 2% listings, they get less money than 3% listings, then 2.5? This is where the industry, it's indefensible that you cannot ever make the argument that if listings are not being hampered by a 3 versus a 2 offer compensation, or a 2 versus 2, if the variance doesn't alter a higher net dollar for a seller, then how can you make the argument that no commission or some small commission is going to have the same effect? You understand what I'm saying? Like you can't make the argument. I mean, where is the number? Is it 1%? Every realtor says, I'm not going to show the property. Is it 1.25%? Everyone says, I'm not going to show the property. Is it 1.75%? I mean, if you're making that statement to a seller, you are in fact implying collusion. You follow what I'm saying? If you are making the recommendation to sellers that, listen, if you don't offer, 2, or no one's going to show it. That in of itself is a statement of collusion between realtors. Right? What is everybody getting together in a room in the buyer agency world going, okay, we're not going to show houses at 2%? You're admitting collusion by that statement. So the reality is that when you try to send a message to a seller that if you don't pay, something bad's going to happen, the first thing you're doing is you're admitting collusion. Number two, when you say that, you're also kind of disconnected to the way our world works in 2025.
Mm-hmm.
When a buyer goes shopping for a home, the last I saw it, they shop for homes. I don't think they're online shopping for real estate agents. They're shopping for houses.
Right.
They find houses they want to see, then they engage the agent. But does the industry still believe that we live in a world where if there is a piece of inventory, if there is a piece of merchandise on the market that every single buyer on the planet has access to, do we live in a world where people think that that buyer is not going to take a look at that piece of inventory because they can't reconcile a compensation agreement with a buyer agent? I mean, it's ludicrous.
Mm-hmm.
So if you send these messages to sellers that if you don't pay compensation, something bad is going to happen, when you really unpack it, it's lunacy. Now, are there buyers who will not, go see a listing unless their buyer agent is getting paid? Yeah, I'm sure there is. Just like you can find some, but the scale, the largest group of people in the world, do you think? And by the way, the other piece of lunacy with respect to this whole, something bad is going to happen thing if you don't offer a commission is, as you mentioned, the buyers have other ways of getting to the inventory. They could go directly to the listing agent, which is called dual agency, which is legal in almost every state. And even in the states where it's not quote unquote legal, they have workarounds for it to allow it to occur. But the idea is that buyers that want access to inventory are going to get to it under their own terms and conditions, not someone else's. And there are listing agents out there who are, recalibrating their business where they are earning their compensation from their seller of whatever commission they put in their value proposition. And one of their value propositions can be for their sellers is that if a buyer comes to me directly, the fee that I'm charging you, Mr. Seller, will absorb any work I have to do if a buyer comes to me directly. So at the end of the day, that buyer might pay $0 to deal with the dual agent. That listing agent might charge the buyer a fee to do it, which is legal and allowable and doable. So the buyer has the choice of hiring their own agent if they want to, hiring an agent that meets their compensation expectation that they can negotiate, going directly to the listing agent and be in a dual agency situation, which might cost them some amount of money or might cost them $0. But they also have another option, Scott, of maybe retaining an attorney
Right.
want to present that offer on their behalf, and the attorney might charge them a fee. The attorney. So I'm not. We have to realize the industry has to accept, and here we are 9 months after this thing went into effect. There's still a tremendous resistance behind it, and it's not so much resistance. It's you don't have a lot of listing agents that are, that are selling the narrative of, option number 3, as I discussed earlier. Consider paying compensation, but you don't have to, because the industry is still locked on. You got to get, and everyone, and most markets, you'll hear this. They'll say, Scott, it's March of 2025 and nothing has really changed. Sellers are still offering compensation. And that's true. But we are seeing the needle move. I mean, if it was, 100%, now it's down to 95, whatever, 90, it's changing. I see it every day.
Right.
So it's moving. But the fact that the sellers are still paying, I mean, that is a very satisfying thing to hear if you're a buyer's agent. Nothing's changed, sellers. But if I'm a listing agent, to me, why not use this new policy opportunity for what it was designed to do? It's designed to articulate your value in a clear and concise way and give that seller those 3 options. And in many cases, listing agents are actually earning more money because they're now able to be unshackled with their full value of what their listing services are. They're no longer burdened by having to be responsible to collect, to charge, articulate, negotiate for a buyer's agent who might have been in the business for 35 seconds before they got their license, and they're earning the same amount of compensation as a 30-year veteran. It doesn't really make sense. So if I'm a listing agent, it's a tremendous, tremendous opportunity. You said it's the golden age. I think it's the platinum age. It's much, much better because now you are really unfettered, unshackled as a listing agent. And that's really what it's about. But again, macro view, the majority of the industry are buyer's agents. The majority of realtors are buyer agents. The majority. So, while this policy started out with, sellers, it flowed into the impact on the buyer's agents. And, it's just amazing. But, again, I think that there's one group of people that I think the industry is totally underestimating. And it is the consumer. Sellers are getting wiser. Buyers are getting wiser. It's taken some time. Nothing happens overnight. But I've heard countless stories of listing agents who walk into an appointment for a listing and, the seller stops them in their tracks and says, listen, I heard something's up with commissions. What's it all about? And the agent then tries to kind of unfold this, yeah, that might be the case, but you really need to pay. At the end of the day, it's nothing different. And these sellers are going, you know what? I don't know. I need to think about it. I'm hearing other things. You got to give more credence to the sellers. And I think that as a listing agent, I've never called it a listing presentation. I've always called it a listing education. And you've never had a better time to educate sellers than right now.
Well, there are so many available options. And I also believe that there are going to be fewer options for buyer's agents if and when the government, Department of Justice.
Well, who knows about that? But let's jump back to the seller with compensation. And we've talked about this before. If you're a seller and you're willing to offer money to sell your house, right? Let's say you're a seller and you're convinced that, okay, I've got a few percent here that I could put out there in the ecosystem to drive opportunity, right? Because that's what it's all about, right? We want to attract buyers, right? Well, the last I heard, the best thing you can do to attract a buyer to whether it's your home, your listing, or anything is to offer what?
Closing cost contribution.
Compensation, right? So we don't have to necessarily, if you're a seller, you don't have to necessarily offer compensation to a buyer's agent. You can actually offer compensation to the buyer. And the highly misunderstood, all valuable seller concession tool is a tremendous way to do it. A seller concession is an amount of money that the seller can offer towards buyer's closing costs. And we know, especially now, that everything is very expensive, right? Closing costs are up. just like eggs and milk and butter, right? Closing costs are higher. So what could we do as a seller to offer an incentive to come take a look at my listing? Well, you can offer a seller concession towards closing costs. And those closing costs can be anything from paying the buyer's legal fees, paying the buyer's title insurance, paying the buyer's survey costs, pay the buyers some of the, but one of the other great allocations for closing costs is to pay the buyer's buy down for an interest rate. Now, if I'm a seller and I really want to incentivize a buyer to come see my home, what if I offered a buyer a 1 or a 2% rate buy down option on the mortgage that they're going to look at? And right now, where mortgage rates are today, if we were to take some of that seller concession money and use it to buy down the interest rate for the buyer, now that buyer can get a below market interest rate, right? And start saving money per month. And if they held that mortgage for a certain amount of years, it could be thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So there's options there on the table. So if you're a listing agent and you want to have some, giving your seller some options, that's another option. Now, again, if I'm a buyer's agent, do I want that money going towards my commission, or do I want that money going towards the buyer's rate buy down? Again, depending upon what that buyer agent arranged with the buyer, maybe they could tell the buyer, listen, in order for you to fund my commission as a buyer's agent, I'm going to get your closing costs paid for in the deal. This way it'll free up your cash to pay me. Either way, the buyer's paying it. I mean, one way or the other, the buyer's going to pay it. You know, when realtors say, well, we're going to throw the commission in the deal, who's paying it? I mean, if the buyer's financing it, they're paying it in the payment. If they're financing it, they're paying it in the rate. They're paying it in the price. I mean, there's no free way to get there, right? So it's all how you present it. But there's a lot of buyers out there who, if given the choice, you know, what should I do? Now, again, on the industry side, they say, well, you know, you need me to get the house. You need me to get the house. And I get that. In some cases, that is very much the case. But we know that buyers have a straight beeline to inventory. There's no stopping them. There's no blocking them. And if you know, you understand that as a listing agent, what is your job? List, acquire inventory, have a listing acquisition strategy. If you're not going out there and trying to get listings every single day, I really don't know the viability of what an agent's day is going to look like 6 months or a year in the future, maybe even sooner, you know. And as you've said, Scott, and as we've mentioned in the past, if we come into a world, and if the DOJ is successful, or if it's not the DOJ, if the world lines up where seller compensation will no longer even be allowed, right? Because kind of when you think about it, you know, the fact that the seller still offers it, you know, kind of does create some confusion to a degree. But if we get into a world where there is no seller compensation to a buyer's agent fee, meaning that a buyer agent is going to have to get their money from the buyer, that's it. Now, the reaction to that, when you hear that, is, oh, well, that's going to be terrible for buyers, because buyers aren't going to be able to afford to pay a realtor. Have you heard that?
Sure, many times.
But how much will it cost a buyer if they go to the listing agent directly who's not charging a fee?
Nothing.
Now, what you hear also is oh, well, this isn't good because listing agents are going to sell it to their own buyers and double end deals. Listen, this goes right back to ethics. You know, you talk about conflicts and talk about unscrupulous people. You have that now. You've had that forever. So if we're going to make the argument that that can't work because of ethics, then what we're saying is that we are an unethical industry, which I don't believe we are. And I believe that there's way more ethical agents than unethical ones. And if this purges out the unethical agents, then so be it. But if the go-to argument is that can't work because listing agents are going to work for their own benefit, then we have a much bigger problem. Then you at least acknowledge you're working in a completely unethical industry, and who's to say you're not ethical, right? So it just doesn't hold water. So the reality is that if you're a good quality, highly ethical listing agent, whether you do dual agency or not, you can, you don't have to. There's many ways in which you can operate. You have freedom, flexibility, options galore as a listing agent. But the real issue is, and you don't hear enough about it, everyone's talking about commissions. Flip the word from commissions and talk about prospecting. Go out there and learn how to prospect. All your commission problems will come to an end if you know how to prospect for listings.
And that's what you're focused on, is, of course.
Yeah, listen, everyone argues about, the 1%, 0.5%, 2%. Go out there and get 10 more listings and you don't have to worry about it. So those who seem to argue most about commissions are usually the ones I find that they're not prospectors. They just want to, you got to be an aggressive, smart, creative prospector. And if you do that for listings, your problems will take care of themselves. You will not be worrying about compensation.
Well, that's great information for realtors to kind of adjust their thinking. And I think it's amazing opportunity for lenders to create that, I call it relationship-based training, where this positive information and really necessary instruction is available only to those lenders that want to support their agent.
Well, remember, the lending community is also, going to go through, if they're not going through it already, because, many of their referral partners are buyer agents, right?
Sure.
And if buyer agents begin to struggle with compensation, what's going to happen? Who's going to be getting it? And I've said this to the lending community, that you have to recalibrate your relationships to the listing agents, and you have to help your buyer's agents become listing agents. And it's a great opportunity for a lender. Now, in many cases, a lot of these lenders say, well, what do I know about getting a listing? Exactly. Learn it. Learn how to do it. Learn how to prospect for a listing with your realtor partner. Develop a new skill set, right? New skill set. Do something new. You mean I got to do something different? Yeah. Now, if you're a loan officer and you help your realtor partners get listings, you don't really have to ask for much business. You'll get the business, right? That's the best you can do for your realtor, is to get them a listing opportunity that sells, right? Where they could probably make a huge multi-$1,000 commission because of your efforts. So again, you got resistance on that side too. You've got lender resistance, I don't want to go out there and do that. I'm not going to go out there and prospect on a Sunday. I get it. Change is extraordinarily difficult. But yet, if you ask anybody who's super successful, they've always adapted and changed, right? So just plagiarize successful people. They all have something in common. We all adapt. We all change. We all evolve. We don't stay one way, And by the way, there are certain people who are anomalies. There are some loan officers and there are some realtors who haven't changed in 50 years and somehow they manage to be successful. But those are the rare cases. Those are not anything with scale. Mm-hmm. Those are not the ones you want to bring to the masterminds. Some old codger sitting up there on a stage going, I'm a successful agent and I don't even know how to use Google.
Okay.
They're an anomaly. There's always those.
They could also be in a market where I have someone who's, at a country club in Scarsdale. Okay. Not everyone can have that. We know.
I was at I did a gig a few months ago, and they were giving out awards before I went up there. And this realtor won an award for, the highest gross commission income for the company. She was number one. And I went up to her and I found out she sold 2 homes.
There you go. How much? 20 million each or something like that?
2 big sales. This is a great, you can make crazy money sometimes, but it just doesn't always appear the way it is. There's a lot of fiction online, right? All these realtors that think they're fashion models, walk in slow motion through their listings and with the music in the background and the cool hip hop, beat behind. And as they get in and out of their leased, luxury vehicle, you don't really, it gives a very wrong sense of what it really takes, to be in this business. And, I think that as a lender, especially with new agents, generally new agents don't get the love, but take some of these brand new agents and help them become prospectors out in the field. lock on with them early as a financial partner, and you'll have them for a very long time if you help them build their career.
Right. And it really is a trickle down because we are fiduciaries. The law creates a position of a selfless representation that really only executors of wills, attorneys, and realtors have. Not many people are working for the benefit of their client as we are.
Doctors, I think they have a fiduciary, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. But they're here to heal, right? You got to care then. But this is an opportunity to see that these changes have freed us from some of the locked in positions, and really people can benefit. I think the biggest benefit you mentioned is that a seller and a listing agent together with a lender control the buyer's prospects of affording the home and getting in the home. The prior opportunity was for a buyer to ask and for some closing cost assistance, and they would compete against others that did not make that request, and they'd be reaching a listing agent and a seller that didn't even have any idea what they're talking about. Now the seller can take control and say, listen, we were formally allocating funds to pay a realtor who does not work for us. Why don't we use that same amount of money or even less and make it easier for a buyer to qualify for a loan, go to a closing with closing costs, have lower monthly payments, make it more attractive. That's the number one.
And the other thing too is just not, it's like this other narrative you hear about, well, if you offer out, we get you top dollar for your home. How do you ever know what top dollar is? That's another mythical number that people spew all the time. I'm getting you top dollar, what is top dollar? Top dollar just means that's the offer that you accepted. You don't know if you could have gotten 50 cents more, right? You have no idea. You accept the offer based upon what the seller wanted and the buyer wanted, and you created a meeting of the minds. We never really know what top dollar really is. And that's another, I think, fictitious statement. I've heard agents say, well, my listing is it's the highest one that is sold in this community. Okay, but it doesn't mean you couldn't got more money for it, right? How do you ever really know? It's just one of those euphemisms, if that's the right word. It's one of those things that we just say with total recklessness. Oh, top dollar, you have to do it to get top dollar. What does that even mean? And how do you even prove it? And how do you verify it? How do you know if you had a bidding war and you had 4 offers and you accepted one and let the other 3 go away? How do you know if you didn't hang out there longer, you would have gotten more money? You don't know. You don't know. You could have, you could not have. But to make these statements like they're fact, like I got you topped up, it's just like, they talk about the used car salesman kind of yeah, I'm going to get you topped out. Like, we sell cars for the lowest prices. Do you ever really believe that? When you see those, when you drive by, buy the lowest prices in New Jersey. I mean,
or the best bagel in Morristown.
Best bagel. This is my best one. Voted #1 best bagel. I always say by who?
People who are happy. But fantastic, Scott. Listen, we are really poised to offer this insight and the questions and the answers to the realtors in America, the lenders in America, title companies, home inspectors, whatever entity wants to support their agent referral partners and wants to help them thrive under the new policy environment. We are here. And I want to say that I think that your information is better, different than I've heard exist in boards or associations or groups or even companies. Companies are maybe too self-serving because